paper which was on free trade agreements and their implications on human trafficking. So I just click up,
Down.
down. Thank you. Oh,
Maybe not.
maybe not. All right. I'll stand to this side. Then can everybody still see if I stand here? Okay. All right. So the first thing I'd like to have everybody do is I would like to have everybody read the legal definition of human trafficking as defined in the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. And this is just so that everybody who may not be familiar with the term of human trafficking can kind of get acquainted with it. And for those that may already be familiar, just to take note that it's actually a much broader range than a lot of people initially think. There are a lot of stereotypes involved in human trafficking, and the range which activities fall under trafficking can be a lot larger. And I actually want to show a couple of photos of situations where you may not think trafficking can be implicated, but many times it can. So here I have forced labor, agricultural trafficking, domestic servitude, child soldiers. These are all circumstances of human trafficking that may not immediately come to mind. You may have heard human trafficking referred to as modern-day slavery. This is a fairly common term. Even the U.S. government uses this term. The State Department publishes a Trafficking in Persons report on an annual basis. And in 2012, Secretary of State at the time, Hillary Clinton, and Ambassador Luis C. DeBaca used the term modern slavery in their opening letter and introduction. They even went so far as to mention the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment, which I found interesting. And I think that the way in which they referred to the U.S. history of slavery, they were meaning to emphasize the U.S. commitment to the abolition of slavery. While these references do recognize our dark history of slavery and are accomplishing it and abolishing it, there is an untold truth to be told in respect to U.S. history, slavery, and modern-day trafficking. And that is that the U.S. is always at the forefront of creating ways to capitalize on economic growth. The free labor that was involved in the slave trade provided a huge economic competitive advantage for the United States, much in the way that today the free market exists where companies can take advantage of extremely low wage incomes or low labor costs and lax labor laws in countries of production, and then turn around and sell those products in upper income first world economies like the United States. Next, I wanted to talk about the theory of push and pull, which discusses migration and vulnerability. And it basically says people leave their countries of origin in situations that they may face a lack of job opportunities or low standards of living. They may be displaced because of natural disasters or political instability. And then they go to pull economies like that of the United States where there may be more job opportunities, there's a higher standard of living, and they may have more stable lives here. But in the transit, there are intervening obstacles, and this is where their vulnerabilities may expose them to trafficking circumstances. So now I'd like to talk a little bit more specifically about how these free trade agreements can put people into those push factors. And one of the problems really is subsidies. These free trade agreements actually grant subsidies to large transnational corporations to sell their goods in other countries. And these large subsidies allow these corporations to flood the markets with under market price goods. And this especially happens in the agricultural communities a lot, and local farmers just absolutely cannot compete with the low prices, and a lot of them are driven out of business. So they are forced to move to urban centers, and many of them want to continue living agricultural lives, so they move north looking for agricultural jobs. North, when I say north, I mean the United States. This has happened in the case of 1.5 million Mexican corn farmers, and so there's been a lot of pushback on this. I just wanted to show a couple of pictures. I don't know if anybody speaks Spanish, but he's definitely speaking out against the free trade agreement, and that's what they call NAFTA. There's the TLCAN. And I think it's important to consider the prominent agricultural history of many of these countries, because if you're looking at generational farmers whose families have been doing this for generations and generations, it puts them in very difficult circumstances when they're pushed out of business. As I just mentioned, people migrate to urban centers when they can no longer sustain their ways of living. It's really important to note that many of these cities already had high existing levels of poverty and economic inequalities. So when there's a mass influx of people coming in from rural areas, it just exacerbates these conditions. As the number of unemployed poor people rise, these people turn to desperate measures just to find the means for survival. And for this reason, in a lot of these urban centers is where you will find sex trafficking hubs. With all of that being said, I did want to discuss the goals of free trafficking, why they were created in the first place. They were created to increase trade within these regions by tariff elimination and deregulation, and it was meant to benefit both host and home economies. There is an unspoken goal, however, and in a congressional committee, one congressman described it as, quote, a government-sanctioned insurance scheme for rising investments by transnational corporations in low-wage nations, starting with Mexico, unquote. This goal sets the stage for exploitation, which in many cases may cross from labor right violations into human trafficking situations. Export processing zones are really at the root of this problem, and these zones are duty-free zones free from government regulation. The problem is that these special zones don't actually feed back into the host economies. In fact, they've actually proved to have backward linkages in the host economies. Additionally, the wages here are at or below poverty level, and the working conditions are poor. Abuse and intimidation are rather commonplace in these areas, and the workers' testimonies have reported verbal and physical abuse, being forced to stay inside the factory using the presence of armed guards, and quotas set so high that the workers could not afford the time for water or bathroom breaks. So you can see how the line can be very blurry from where labor violations go and where human trafficking may begin. I think I have a picture of this sweatshop photo there. The last thing I wanted to address was often when people hear about this type of abuse, they question why don't they organize and advocate for their rights. And I was really dismayed to find that the answers lie in the treaties themselves. NAFTA, CAFTA, and many other free trade agreements actually give multinational corporations the right to sue the host government if they enforce any law or regulation that would undermine the profits of that company. And if individuals stand up for their rights, it can actually end up much worse. In the example of Colombia, in 2011 alone, companies were accused of hiring private military groups to stifle labor organization, and 29 union leaders were actually killed during that year. If the governments and people themselves are unable to stand up to this type of injustice, these treaties really should be amended to include human rights considerations. And the last thing I wanted to mention is I was listening to the radio this morning and I just realized how relevant this is in the light of what happened in Bangladesh last week, where a factory collapsed and there were 5 garment factories inside and 510 people have been were killed in that accident. And that is all I have in the references, and thank you to my teacher and mentor.